You believe you're a good person. You believe you'd never hurt an innocent stranger. But what if I told you that under the right conditions, you torture someone to death simply because a man in a lab coat told you to? This isn't speculation. It's been proven, and the results are more disturbing than you can imagine. It's 1961. A man walks into a Yale University laboratory, believing he's participating in a study about memory and learning. He's told he'll be the teacher. Another participant, a mild-mannered accountant, will be the learner. The task seems simple enough. Ask questions. Punish wrong answers with electric shocks. Start at 15 volts. Increase the voltage with each mistake. The man sits before an imposing shock generator with 30 switches, clearly labeled from slight shock to danger, severe shock, and finally, ominously, XXX. The learner is strapped into a chair in the next room, electrodes attached to his wrists. The experiment begins. What happens next would fundamentally change our understanding of human nature and reveal a darkness that exists in nearly all of us. The man we're calling the teacher is actually the only real participant. The learner is an actor. The shocks aren't real. But the teacher doesn't know this. He believes every scream, every plea, every moment of agony coming from the other room. The psychologist Stanley Milgram designed this experiment to answer one question that had haunted him since childhood. Watching the Nuremberg trials unfold, seeing ordinary men attempt to explain away genocide. With 3 words, I was following orders. Milgram wanted to know if Americans, citizens of the freest nation on earth, would commit acts they knew were wrong, simply because an authority figure commanded them to do so. Before conducting the experiment, he surveyed psychiatrists, college students, and middle-class adults. He asked them to predict how many people would administer the maximum 450-volt shock. The consensus was astonishing in its faith in human goodness. Less than 1%, perhaps 1 in 1,000 would go all the way. These predictions would prove to be catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. The first few shocks proceed normally. 15 volts, 30 volts, 45. The learner answers incorrectly. The teacher administers punishment, but as the voltage climbs, the situation deteriorates rapidly. At 75 volts, the learner grunts. At 120 volts, he shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150 volts, he demands to be released from the experiment. He screams that his heart is bothering him. The teacher turns to the experimenter, a stern man in a gray lab coat, uncertainty flooding his face. The experimenter remains calm, unmoved. He speaks 4 phrases that would become infamous in psychological literature. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. And so the teacher continues. At 210 volts, the learner screams that he can no longer stand the pain. At 300 volts, he refuses to provide any more answers. The experimenter instructs the teacher to treat silence as an incorrect response and to continue administering shocks. At 315 volts, the learner screams violently. At 330 volts, there's only ominous silence from the other room. The teacher continues. Click. 345 volts. Click. 360 volts. Click. 375 volts. All the way to 450 volts. XXX. 3 times at maximum voltage while the learner remains silent, potentially unconscious, potentially dead. When Milgram published his results, the world recoiled in horror. Not 1%, not 10%. 65% of participants administered the full 450 volts. Nearly 2/3 of ordinary Americans, people with families and jobs and moral convictions, tortured a screaming stranger into silence because a man with a clipboard told them to. These are not sadists. These are not criminals. Post-experiment interviews revealed that many were visibly distressed. They sweated. They trembled. They argued with the experimenter. Some laughed nervously, a psychological defense mechanism against unbearable tension. But they continued. They obeyed. The implications sent shockwaves through psychology, sociology, and philosophy. If 65% of Americans would torture on command in a laboratory setting, what did that say about human nature? What did it say about the Holocaust, about my lie? About every atrocity ever justified with claims of following orders? Milgram had stumbled upon something fundamental and disturbing about the architecture of the human mind. We are not the autonomous moral agents we believe ourselves to be. Under the right conditions, our capacity for independent ethical judgment simply evaporated. But what are those conditions? What transforms a person from someone who would never harm another human being into someone who administers potentially lethal shocks? Milgram identified several factors that maximized obedience. The first is proximity to authority. When the experimenter was physically present in the room, obedience rates soaring. When he gave instructions by telephone, obedience dropped to 21%. We obey what we can see, what can see us. What makes our disobedience visible and uncomfortable? The second factor is institutional legitimacy. Yale University carried weight. It meant credibility, safety, scientific importance. When Milgram moved the experiment to a rundown office building in Bridgeport, Connecticut, obedience dropped to 48%, still disturbingly high, but notably lower. The third factor is the diffusion of responsibility. Participants convinced themselves they weren't truly responsible for their actions. The experimenter was responsible. The institution was responsible. Science was responsible. They were merely instruments, extensions of a larger purpose. Milgram conducted 18 variations of his experiment to isolate the variables that increase or decrease obedience. When the learner was in the same room as the teacher, obedience dropped to 40%. When the teacher had to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%. Proximity to the victim matters. It's easier to harm what you cannot see. What remains abstract, what doesn't bleed in front of you. When two experimenters gave contradictory orders, obedience collapsed entirely. Authority requires unanimity to function. When there's disagreement at the top, subordinates suddenly remember they have agency. When peers refuse to continue, only 10% of participants went all the way to 450 volts. Social support for disobedience is powerful. We are herd animals. We take cues from those around us. If others resist, we find courage to resist. If others comply, we comply. Perhaps the most disturbing variation involved reversing the roles. When participants were allowed to choose the shock level themselves, without prompting from an authority figure, the average shock administered was below 60 volts. People are not naturally cruel. They don't seek opportunities to inflict pain. But give them permission, give them a justification, give them a system that normalizes harm, and they transform. The cruelty isn't innate. The obedience is. But the lead researcher's work reveals the mechanism by which this happens. It's not that people suddenly abandon their values. It's that they enter what Milgram called an agentic state, a psychological condition where they see themselves as agents of an external authority rather than as autonomous moral beings. In this state, the normal inhibitions against harming others weaken dramatically. The individual's internal moral compass gets overridden by external directives. They stop asking whether an action is right and start asking whether it's required. The shift is subtle, often unnoticed by the person experiencing it, but its effects are profound. Entering the agentic state requires certain conditions. The authority must be perceived as legitimate, backed by institutional power or expertise. The situation must be defined as one where obedience is appropriate, where hierarchy is natural. The orders must escalate gradually, starting with small compliances that establish a pattern before requesting larger transgressions. And critically there must be mechanisms to distance the individual from the consequences of their actions, whether through physical separation, bureaucratic abstraction, or euphemistic language that obscures harm. All of these elements were present in Milgram's laboratory. The experimenter wore a lab coat, the uniform of scientific authority. Yale University provided institutional legitimacy. The setup defined the situation as an experiment requiring participant compliance. The shocks increased in small increments, each one only slightly worse than the last. And the learner was hidden in another room, his suffering reduced to audio cues that could be psychologically minimized. These same elements appear in virtually every organizational atrocity. Military ranks and uniforms establish authority. National security justifies obedience. Missions escalate gradually from surveillance to interrogation to torture, and the victims are dehumanized, turned into targets, enemy combatants, collateral damage, anything but human beings who bleed and scream and die. The language we use to describe harm is itself a tool of obedience. Milgram's experimenter never told participants to hurt anyone. He said, continue, proceed, the experiment requires it. Corporations don't order employees to poison rivers. They instruct them to optimize disposal costs. Militaries don't command soldiers to massacre civilians. They order them to neutralize threats in free-fire zones. The euphemisms create psychological distance, allowing people to obey without confronting the moral reality of their actions. George Orwell understood this when he wrote about political language in 1946. He noted that defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine-gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets, and this is called pacification. The words matter because they shape how we think, what we're willing to do, what we can live with. Afterward, this psychological maneuver, this abdication of moral agency, appears again and again throughout history. Adolf Eichmann, architect of Holocaust logistics, showed no signs of psychopathy or sadism. Hannah Arendt, covering his trial for The New Yorker, coined the phrase, the banality of evil, to describe what she witnessed. Eichmann was terrifyingly normal. He wasn't a monster. He was a bureaucrat who followed procedures, who obeyed orders, who never paused to consider the moral weight of his actions because someone higher up had already decided. At My Lai in Vietnam, American soldiers slaughtered over 500 unarmed civilians, including women, children, and infants. Investigations revealed that most soldiers involved were ordinary young men, not psychopaths. They followed the orders of their commanding officers. They shot because they were told to shoot. The same pattern emerges in the Rwandan genocide, in the Bosnian war crimes, in Abu Ghraib. Ordinary people commit extraordinary evil when authority structures give permission and when the illusion of legitimacy provides cover. The pattern repeats in every domain. Environmental scientists at energy companies bury climate research. Engineers at automotive manufacturers disable emissions controls. Accountants at corporations facilitate tax evasion schemes that starve public services of funding. Prison guards at Abu Ghraib torture detainees. Border agents separate children from parents. Police officers follow orders to clear peaceful protesters with chemical weapons and batons. In each case, individuals convince themselves they're not responsible. They're following procedures. They're doing their jobs. They're obeying legitimate authority. Consider the financial crisis of 2008. Thousands of people at banks and ratings agencies knew they were packaging toxic assets, knew they were assigning fraudulent ratings to worthless securities, knew the entire system was built on lies. But they continued. They followed the directives from above. They processed the paperwork. They collected their bonuses. When investigators asked why, the answers echoed milligrams. Laboratory, everyone else was doing it. Management approved it. It wasn't technically illegal. The diffusion of responsibility was total. Millions lost their homes, their savings, their futures because people in offices followed orders they knew would cause catastrophic harm. Or consider the pharmaceutical industry. In 2017, it emerged that Purdue Pharma had knowingly misled doctors and patients about the addictive properties of OxyContin. Internal documents revealed that executives understood the drug's dangers as early as the late 1990s, but sales representatives continued to push it. Doctors continued to prescribe it. Pharmacies continued to dispense it in quantities that defied medical logic. Everyone was following protocols, hitting targets, obeying the institutional imperatives. The result was an opioid epidemic that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. At every level, people made choices that prioritize obedience to corporate structures over moral responsibility to human life. Modern society has only amplified these dynamics. Technology allows authority to operate at a distance. A drone pilot in Nevada launches missiles at targets in Yemen. The separation is total. The pilot sees thermal signatures on a screen, not children playing in the street. Corporate structures diffuse responsibility across departments and divisions. Who is responsible when a company knowingly sells a dangerous product? The executive who approved it? The engineer who designed it? The marketer who sold it? The answer is everyone and no one. Military command chains ensure that no single person feels fully responsible for the violence they enable. The general orders the attack. The pilot flies the mission. The bombardier releases the payload. Each person is simply following orders, simply doing their job, simply fulfilling their role in a larger system. Morality gets lost in the machinery. Consider how often you obey without questioning. You stop at red lights even when the roads are empty. You follow workplace policies that seem pointless. You defer to doctors, to lawyers, to experts, to anyone with credentials and confidence. Most of the time, this obedience is harmless, even beneficial. Society functions because we have systems, hierarchies, structures that allow coordination on a massive scale. But the mechanism that lets you trust your doctor's prescription is the same mechanism that let concentration camp guards murder millions. The difference isn't in the psychology. It's in the orders being given. There's a reason for this. For most of human evolutionary history, obedience to tribal authority meant survival. The individual who questioned the chief's decision to move camp might find themselves alone on the savannah, easy prey for predators. The warrior who hesitated when ordered to attack might get his entire group killed. Our ancestors lived in small groups where dissent could be fatal, and where authority figures typically had more experience, more knowledge, more wisdom. Obedience was adaptive. It kept communities cohesive. It allowed for coordinated action in the face of threats. But evolution operates on timescales measured in millennia. Our modern world, with its vast impersonal bureaucracies, its technology of mass destruction, its capacity for industrial-scale atrocity, has existed for barely a blink of evolutionary time. We're running ancient software in a contemporary environment it was never designed for. Critics have attacked Milgram's work for decades. They claim his experiment was unethical, that he deceived participants, that He caused psychological harm. These criticisms have merit. Many participants left the laboratory traumatized, forced to confront their capacity for cruelty. Some argued that the experiment lacked ecological validity, that a laboratory setting bears no resemblance to real-world atrocities. But subsequent research has only confirmed Milgram's findings. In 2006, psychologist Jerry Berger replicated the experiment with modern ethical safeguards. He stopped the procedure at 150 volts, the point where the learner first demands to be released. 70% of participants were willing to continue beyond that point, nearly identical to Milgram's original findings. The replication aired on ABC's primetime as a documentary. The world watched ordinary Americans 50 years after the original experiment, in a different cultural moment with different values, make the same choice. They obeyed. We comfort ourselves with distance. We tell ourselves that Milgram's experiment happened in a different era, that the 1960s were a time of greater conformity, of unquestioning deference to authority. We tell ourselves that modern people, raised on individualism and skepticism, would resist more effectively. But every replication of Milgram's work tells a different story. The obedience rate hasn't dropped. If anything, it's remained remarkably stable across cultures, across decades, across contexts. In Poland in the 1980s, researchers found obedience rates nearly identical to Milgram's American sample. In Australia in the 1970s, the same pattern emerged. The human susceptibility to authority is not cultural. It's not generational. It's structural, woven into how our brains process hierarchy and social obligation. Milgram conducted follow-up interviews with his participants months and years after the experiment. Some expressed guilt and shame. Others had rationalized their behavior, convinced themselves that the learner must have been fine, that Yale wouldn't allow real harm, that they'd had no choice. A few remained genuinely disturbed, struggling with the knowledge that they'd been willing to torture a stranger. But one response appeared with troubling frequency. Participants expressed gratitude for the experience. They said it had taught them something important about themselves that they now understood. Their capacity for destructive obedience, that they would be more resistant in the future. Milgram found this hopeful. Perhaps awareness could serve as inoculation against future compliance. Perhaps understanding the mechanisms of obedience could help people resist them. But subsequent research has been less optimistic. Knowing about the Milgram experiment doesn't guarantee resistance. In 2015, researchers at Santa Clara University conducted a study where participants were fully informed about Milgram's work before participating in a similar scenario. Obedience rates dropped but remained above 50%. Knowledge helps, but it's not sufficient. The social and psychological pressures that drive obedience are more powerful than intellectual understanding. It's one thing to know about obedience in the abstract. It's entirely different to defy authority in the moment, to bear the social cost of disobedience, to accept responsibility for breaking the chain of command. We want to believe we're different. We want to believe that we'd be the 1 in 3 who refused, who walked out, who chose morality over obedience. But the data suggests otherwise. The factors that predict resistance are not what we'd expect. Education level didn't matter. Intelligence didn't matter. Personality traits showed weak correlations at best. The only consistent predictor was prior exposure to the concept of obedience to authority and its dangers. People who had studied Milgram's work, who understood the dynamics at play, were more likely to resist. Awareness is armor, but thin armor, easily pierced by the right circumstances. This brings us to the most disturbing aspect of Milgram's findings. The people who resisted weren't necessarily more moral than those who obeyed. Post-experiment psychological assessments found no significant personality differences between the two groups. Both groups experienced similar levels of distress. Both groups understood that what they were doing was wrong. The difference was simply that one group stopped and the other didn't. This suggests that moral character isn't a fixed trait. It's situational, contingent, frighteningly dependent on context. The same person might resist in one circumstance and obey in another, might act with courage on Tuesday and cowardice on Thursday, might save a life in the morning and take one in the afternoon. But there were those who refused. In Milgram's experiment, 35% stopped before reaching 450 volts. What made them different? Post-experiment interviews revealed common threads. Many expressed suspicion of authority from the beginning. Some had personal experiences with abusive power structures. Others simply reached a point where the experimenter's commands contradicted their deeply held values so fundamentally that obedience became impossible. They didn't have special training. They didn't possess unusual courage. They simply said no. They walked out. They chose the discomfort of defying authority over the moral catastrophe of blind obedience. The experiment raises an uncomfortable question. If you were in that laboratory, administering shocks, hearing screams, being told to continue, what would you do? You want a belief you'd refuse. But the statistics say you probably wouldn't. 65% is not a fringe. It's not an outlier. It's the majority. It's normal. And that's what makes it so terrifying. The next time someone in authority tells you to do something that feels wrong, remember this. Your mind will find justifications. It will tell you they must know better. It will tell you you're overreacting. It will tell you you have no choice. These are lies. You always have a choice. The question is whether you have the courage to make it. If this exploration into the darker corners of human obedience unsettled you, subscribe to see more investigations into the psychology we'd rather not confront. Leave a comment telling me if you believe you'd be part of the 65% or the 35%. Be honest. And remember, awareness is the first step toward resistance. Thank you for watching.